one thing that was really interesting when I was doing a little bit of research for the show was that you used to go outside and smoke cigarettes and drink Diet Coke during your lunch in high school. How did
True.
how did you go from that to now being being involved in naturopathy and a registered dietitian and all the amazing things that you're doing? Where was that rapid change and pendulum shift come from?
Well, I think I fell victim as a child of the 90s and low fat craze and calories in, calories out misinformation of the idea that at that time I was a ballerina. And so it was just staying thin. It wasn't about nourishing your body. So if cigarettes could be a stimulant that could suppress your appetite and diet soda was calorie free and sugar free, then that meant that those were things that would work for my goals. It really took a while for me to understand looking at the body as an instrument, if you will, or this integrate balance of different systems and how nutrients are really important. And I think that that's really 180 now as I'm a mother of a 7-year-old. I've been practicing functional integrative medicine now for over 15 years. You know, I'm often kind of banging the drum against this calories in, calories out. There's no such thing as empty calories. There's actually processed chemical shitstorms that don't belong in the human body and shouldn't be consumed by humans, which we have to stop calling foods and really call food like substances. And then there's real foods. And so I think that this is something that I never even thought of. And so now, as I'm working with clients and I'm trying to inspire others to nourish with food as medicine, it really starts with first off, are you eating food? And is it God food or is it man-made food? And that's really one of the most preliminary things we can toggle out to understand how to best nourish.
Yeah, that's beautiful, and I think real like, food is medicine gets thrown a lot around it gets thrown around a lot.
Mhm.
Nowadays, you see it all over the place. I see it all over the place. I say it myself, but when you actually take a step back and think about what does that really mean? Like, food as medicine. So, when you say that, when you talk about that, when people hear it, like, what does food as medicine really mean?
Sure. So, in my perspective, food as medicine is this double edged sword. So, it's using your daily choice of how you nourish your body, what you call food, what you put in your body, and reducing those things or food like substances that would be pro inflammatory or endocrine disrupting or toxic, maybe containing neurotoxins or gut microbiome disrupting. There's all the world of those types of choices, and so it's this double-edged sword of removing or limiting those irritants or pro-inflammatory processed products, and then consuming an abundance of whole real foods, ideally in a synergy that provides a good balance of macronutrients, has complexity of multivitamin approach of minerals and antioxidants, and this can happen really easily when we go back to ancestral approaches of eating. When we really look at, again, this idea of back to God food, back to less has been done since harvest, less has been messed with it through the growing process. We're returning ruminants back to ruminate on the grasses versus putting them in these confined animal farm operations. As soon as we can get back to these natural patterns, we find these beautiful, complex, nutrient dense whole foods. And these really can surpass any new age superfood that we see on the market. As much as man tries to get ahead of, we really can't get that beautiful balance that nature provides. And uh, just to kind of take it another step, when we talk food as medicine, it's important to understand that the body physiologically, if anyone listening has taken any level of anatomy and physiology and any level of biochemistry, we understand that the body requires nutrients for every biological function, every single enzymatic process, every single from your respiration of your lungs, all the way to how your kidneys balance your pH, all the way to how our body goes through lipolysis and burns fat. all the way through our detoxification processes. Our body requires nutrients. And so when you're using food as medicine, you're giving the body an abundance of something that it understands and knows what to do with versus a foreign substrate like a medication. And you're actually up regulating these areas of imbalance or higher demands in the body with strategy. And that's what takes this kind of preliminary food as medicine into more of a functional medicine, or what would be the fancy term orthomolecular therapy, or high dose nutrient focus for particular chronic illness or imbalance that's being expressed.
What I love about talking with people like you who are so passionate about this and really helping people just live optimal, healthy lives is they have a story themselves. Like it wasn't just like you just stumbled upon to this stuff, right? Because it's not like promoted. It's not like easily found. It's not accessible. If you ask anybody what functional medicine means, or if they've ever been to a functional medicine doctor or practitioner, if they know what naturopathy means, most people don't know. And I really didn't know until I had some health problems and I went to like a functional nutritionist, and I was like, wow, this
Mhm.
really radically improved my life. So what was it for you that sent you down this path?
Well, initially, it was a passion for being a locavore and getting connected to my food system, and that was early in college. I was very involved with farmers markets and wanting to visit organic farms. And I became a vegetarian and a vegan in that process, which was a total wrong turn in my nutrient density. But I had thought from the documentaries I had watched and the limited amount of information I had read that you could cure cancer from a raw food diet. So this is what I should do. I went to Bastyr University, which is the number one accredited naturopathic college in the country. And I was very excited that they had a vegetarian cafeteria because the president, the alma mater, Dr. Bastyr, was a vegetarian. And yet, when I got there, I really had to start to redefine my relationship with food. I started to learn more about the role of ruminants and animals in a sustainable agricultural model, in the way that after the chicken tractor would be released to break up the cow piles of feces, that they were adding nitrogen back into the soil, and that the microbes were actually creating more robust root systems for the plants. So I started to kind of make peace with that process, but still not related to what I was consuming. And then I really started to suffer with some micronutrient deficiencies on a clinical level, not a subclinical. I had a B12 deficiency related anemia. I also was dealing with shortness of breath and panic attacks. I had low iron, and I was consuming a lot of anti nutrients in a high amount. I was not denaturing them through a cooking process. I was doing a lot of raw, and I was using as my protein choices soy and gluten. Actually, it was called Seitan. It was a vital wheat gluten concentrate that was really big in the mid 2000s. And so I was hitting my thyroid with gluten and soy, and I ended up being diagnosed with Hashimoto's thyroiditis. And at that time, I was working as a student clinician at the Bastyr Clinic and then also a patient at the Bastyr Clinic. And it was quite the juxtaposition where I had to really, like I said, redefine my relationship with food and come to peace with becoming an omnivore. I knew that the clinical deficiencies that I had could be corrected with food, but I had to break up with the dogma or the doctrine. And that's when I really started using this phrase that I use throughout my book, The Anti Anxiety Diet, which is doctrine creates disconnect. And I think that this is really important for anyone on a wellness journey. You have to pivot and pause and do a little bit of an internal surveillance on what was working for you, maybe in the onset of your journey, how your lifestyle, your stressors, your body's demands have shifted, and we can't get too stagnant or too locked in a title or a name of a protocol or diet or even our macros. Our body really needs to have that ease and that ability to shift with season, and our demands will vary. But I do feel strongly that the body is wired to be an omnivore, including both plants and animal products. And that really, in order to have optimal nutritional status, you do need to integrate animal into the diet.
What is your take on like seasonal eating? I know I've heard you talk a lot about, eating certain foods in season, having, more of a ketogenic diet at certain times of the year, eating more
Mhm.
fruits and vegetables at certain times of the year. So I know it's different based on maybe your lineage or where you're
Sure.
currently living in terms of like the climate of the planet and whatnot. So I know there are a lot of factors that go into it, but how would somebody go about eating seasonally to, fuel their body with what they may need at certain points of the year?
Yeah, so I think also we have to think about with modernized society, we've kind of taken the elements out, right? Because we have central air and or heat. So we're kind of not getting as much hormesis. And when it's cold, we're not actually cold in our homes anymore, or as often, or same when it's hot, we're kind of temp regulating. So we've overwritten a lot of these natural rhythms of the body, which would, I think, otherwise kind of demand a different eating structure. Like if we were sweating our faces off in Austin at 104, like it is, but not balanced, countered with central air, we would be very lethargic. We would not be eating heavy, warm foods likely. I mean, the body is just going to kind of crave and demand based on the stressor or the environmental cue. So if we can try to stay in tune with the seasons, I think that's lovely. I'm a huge proponent of honoring God's most dynamic red light, which is the sun. We get amazing infrared therapy from sunrise and sunset. And so, regardless of the season, if you're honoring getting outside during sunrise and sunset, I think that that really helps to kind of harness you to the season. And so, with that, we tend to think of like slow cookers and roasts and warming foods during the colder months. This also follows more of like an Ayurvedic or traditional Chinese medicine, a lot of warming foods when the body otherwise would have cold or stagnation. So you want circulation. You want to have capsaicins like spicy peppers going on at this time. You want to have, like I said, lower, slower cooks. You're getting more glycine in your animal products from things like short ribs or maybe a like carnitas if you're using like a Boston butt cut or a pork shoulder. A lot of these are going to be kind of seared and then slow cooked. Root vegetables we think of in the colder winter seasons. And then for sure, as we get into the brighter spring, I think spring represents a lot of like edible flowers, microgreens, sprouts, salads. This is when a lot of people are kind of called to do some form of a detox or a reset. A lot of liver support seems to be very appropriate during that time. And then cooler foods that are really hydrating and electrolyte balancing in the summer are very fitting. So this is where we see things like watermelon, cucumber, and like I said, we've unfortunately broken with modernized society. You can get watermelon all year, you can get strawberries all year, you can get tomatoes all year. But we definitely, when we feature our shopping at our farmers market, we can still find ourselves anchoring back in to what's seasonally available, and I think that that can be really helpful.
So it's December 4th, the date we are recording this. So at this point right now, what does maybe your diet, a typical day of eating look like for you? And what are some of the foods that you're leaning heavily on for the next
Yeah.
couple of months as it gets a little bit colder? And what foods are you tending to stay away from?
Sure. So I would be starting days with bone broth and a warm beverage for sure. Whereas, like summer months, I might use ice in my beverages. So, always going to start with something warm, tea with collagen and raw milk, maybe, or bone broth, and then the other might follow. Now, I would be breaking structure, but again, here I was hiking in a sweatshirt. It's not quite, it's still in the kind of 60s ish. So we're not in true winter vibe. And so I'm having a green smoothie. I think that always there's this balance, right? I love a green smoothie as a way to pack in nutrient density. And that's kind of something that I would break any seasonal rules for, just because it's such an easy way for me to ensure that I check off a lot of boxes. So I make this super greens cube once a week where I'll take a container of broccoli sprouts. I'll take 3 different forms of seasonal greens. And so those will change by season. So right now I have winter collard greens, I have rainbow chard, and I have lacinato kale, like the dino kale in there. I have also a little bit of E3 Live, which is an algae spirulina blend in there. And I have a spinach, I think just an organic spinach tub. So all that's packed into the blender. I blend that and then I get 6 cubes. And so each cube is really giving you 2.5 cups of packed greens. So I have that in here with some full fat coconut milk, ginger, so a little bit of warming element there. Flaxseed maca, which is an adaptogen root. And then I have my naturally nourished grass fed whey and collagen. So I'm getting 35 grams of protein. On a day like today, I have 3 recordings. And so I might override the season for something that is easier for me to assimilate. And what I mean by that is like having this 35 grams of protein that I don't have to chew, that I don't have to make as much hydrochloric acid, that I don't have to make as many digestive enzymes. It's kind of pre digested for me. I can nourish myself throughout maybe a higher sympathetic pseudo stress time of delivery and being on versus taking that time to like cut a steak, which might sit heavier or more stagnant in my belly. So that makes sense for me on this kind of stress, which I would override the season. But maybe if it was a more chill day on December 4th, I might have instead 2 fried eggs in pasture raised lard with a handmade pork patty and some kimchi on top or something, you know. But this works for me today for that reason. And then I'll basically sip on probably another mug of broth, and then I'll just go to my meal. And tonight we're doing pan-seared bone-in skin-on chicken thighs with refried black beans, which have nopalitos, a little bit of cactus in there, and habanero pepper and cilantro. And then I have some shishitos, the last of the season, with some cotija cheese and cilantro, and bell peppers and onions. And that's going to be dinner. And then my daughter, who's 7, we take that and we take 2 siete tortillas and make that into a quesadilla. So she can't pick any of it out.
So, yeah, that's interesting. So for me, I've always been very active. I played football in college. Up until fairly recently, the past couple of months, I had been, getting like a workout in the morning and a workout in later on in the day. And with that, I was eating like way more. Obviously, I was eating so much more
Yeah.
than I am now, but also like just feeling sluggish after I would eat. And, food is supposed to nourish us, it's supposed to energize us. But a lot of the foods that, we're told like, "Oh, eat this before and after a workout," like eating like a big bowl of oatmeal or
Mhm.
having, even like I love sourdough bread and like making like like a, sausage, egg and raw cheese out of that, like amazing stuff. But sometimes just feeling like weighed down. So like hearing you talk about, kind of the way that you approach nutrition throughout your day, it sounds like you're having lighter meals, if you even want to call them meals, just like things to provide nutrients to you, and then really, going hard later on in the day and having one big meal. When is that because like you're kind of priming your digestive system later on in the day?
So it breaks a lot of metabolic research, to be clear. So,
Okay.
the metabolic research gold standard would be that you eat your largest meal first thing in the morning, and we're starting to learn so much overriding, intermittent fasting, especially for women. So women and men are very different, and that's its whole other scenario as far as our biochemistry. Women are cyclical on a 28-day cycle, men are stagnant. So women have a lot of stuff going on throughout every month, fluctuations in testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, follicular stimulating hormone, luteal hormone, and men are just same. Like, so that's a totally different beast when we're talking about research that works for men's bodies versus women's. And I think there's been a faux pas in the world of like intermittent fasting where a lot of women fell victim into some of the research that was showing benefits of autophagy or mTOR and all these great geeky things, but throwing off then their leptin, having hormonal dysregulation, their body feeling in a fight or flight surge. And so the best way to metabolically eat, I believe in research for men and women, is to, eat like a king, feast in the morning, and then to slowly kind of end your day like a pauper. And so ideally, really, instead of, most people out here are probably 16 eating where they're not eating till noon, they're fasting on that, like, maybe fat fueled coffee or just tea or just water, breaking their fast at noon and cutting off at 8 p.m. and rinsing and repeating. The ideal circadian metabolic approach would be eating your largest meal within an hour of rise. So maybe that's like 7:30 a.m. and then having a moderate size meal around noon and cutting off around 4 p.m. And that 4 p.m. meal being maybe a lighter option, like maybe this is bone broth with skirt steak, and maybe we're using like kelp noodles in there and some other non-starchy veg. And so maybe it's a 450, 500 cal, but again, lower, easier to assimilate. That's circadian metabolic research as far as how insulin response shifts, as far as how our body best metabolizes. It's most metabolically active in the morning, and then you're burning less calorie through the evening. With that being said, there's always this N equals one, right? And so for me, I know again that I try to harness that parasympathetic space by getting that sunlight first thing in the morning. Then my daughter plays Taylor Swift for 30 minutes in the car when I take her to school, and it's a little different vibe, right? And then I'm like, okay, let's go. And then I have to reharness, recalibrate. And we do know that when we're in a sympathetic nervous system fight or flight surge, that we only make a quarter of the amount of digestive enzymes, and we only, and so that's huge. And then we don't have as much gut microbiome activity when we're stressed. We get more of sterility impact. And so, again, for me, I shift versus ideal circadian rhythm. For me, I go based on the stress flow of my day. And so, for me to have my largest meal in the evening, I am sitting at the table. We've said a prayer. We're talking about our day. I'm super present. Hopefully, we're outside, and that is when I'm going to actually be at my peak nutritional absorption state versus this kind of go, go, go flow. So, as far as workouts go, you could time your workout to be a little bit more spaced based on intake. But that would be the first thing I'd consider is if you're in a stressed mode, you might need the support of a digestive enzyme so that you don't feel that stagnation or that bloat or that heaviness. Or you might need to think of easier to digest food. So, for instance, something like salmon or eggs or a ground meat patty versus something like a steak, which has a lot more mechanical work to do, would be something that we'd consider again based on where our day flows with stress as well as physiological demand.
So it almost sounds like you're saying you could get you could be eating the same meal and not take in all of the nutrients or not get all of the benefits from it just from the state of like being
Totally.
that you're in?
Yes. Yes, because not only do you have only a quarter of the amount of enzymes, when you're in a fight or flight stress surge, which unfortunately a lot of us operate in this all the time, our blood flow is not in our centralized area for our organs because our body is actually ready to fight or flee. So we have a lot more peripheral blood. And we require blood really optimally concentrated along the intestines to pull the nutrients through that gut blood barrier. So when you don't have as many enzymes, you're not breaking down and making things bioavailable. And then when you don't have that blood flow circulated in the central area, you're not getting that pull and that absorption rate.
Mm, wow. That's very
Yeah.
interesting. Very interesting.
Yeah, I used to say, I was like, "You could eat the healthiest, ribeye, kale salad, you name it, but if you're in a stressed mode, it's not gonna do you as good as it would if you can get into that mindful parasympathetic space." And I think we've seen a lot of research on mindful eating that is just nicking at the surface. A lot of the researchers are thinking that that's just awareness. Maybe we're getting better satiety because we're not distracted, but I would say there's likely a lot more physiological shifts going on in the body when we're mindful eating versus not, and that has even impact on blood sugar regulation, on metabolic rate, and so much more.
Mm. So I want to bring up a word that you mentioned earlier that is talked about a lot, and that's inflammation, right? You
Mhm,
hear this anti-inflammatory diet, anti-inflammatory drink, anti-inflammatory shot. There's like I see it all the time, like this word,
mhm.
like anti-inflammatory or inflammation. For the everyday person, like what even is inflammation? How do you know if you're inflamed? I know there's like you can have inflammation in like the brain and the gut and the kidneys, like
Mhm.
there's inflammation everywhere. But could you kind of just, you know, nutrition 101, like what is inflammation and how do people go about knowing like, hey, I'm inflamed?
So, inflammation is really one of the body's protective mechanisms in the repair process, but it can also denote an insult or an injury. And so, the word inflamed literally means on fire. There are five medical signs of inflammation. There's five cardinal signs. So, there's soreness, there's redness, there is puffiness or fluid retention, there is pain, and there is loss of function. So, any of those mechanisms can be markers of inflammation. And then in the medical diagnostic criteria world, any diagnosis with an itis is inflammation of that area. So, if we're saying gastritis. This is inflammation of the gastric pouch. And so this is where someone would have ulcerations in their stomach. If we're saying rheumatoid arthritis, arthritis is inflammation in the joints. And rheumatoid would be autoimmune mediated inflammation in the joints. So any itis is an inflammatory condition as far as diagnosis goes. We can know we're inflamed by looking at biomarkers like HSCRP. That's kind of the standard. And so this is our high sensitivity C reactive protein. We can order also SED rate, and then we can look at complement. And these different worlds will tell us about the inflammation of the individual to know if there is something going on that could create a risk factor as the silent killer. And that's really what is interesting is although there are those five markers of inflammation, sometimes the inflammation is internal, especially when we're talking about the world of cardiovascular disease. This is where we might not be experiencing arrhythmia or any form of hypertension or externally surveyed mechanisms of imbalance. But if CRP is up, we know that that could be a big risk factor for myocarditis, or again, inflammation of the cardiac muscle, right? That's what that would be defined as then. So there are things for sure that are generally going to be anti-inflammatory, and this can be the world of omega-3 fatty acids. These can be a lot of plant-based compounds as well as animal-based fats that can all be anti-inflammatory. But there is an individualized mechanism, or how our immune system surveys, if you will have an influence on someone's superfood and someone else's kryptonite. And so there really isn't like a one stop shop. This is there are definitely something can be higher in antioxidants than another food, which could be measurable. But even though something is superior in an antioxidant level, it might not be as anti inflammatory for you, Dom, than maybe something that's even inferior in that lineage based on how your surveillance system of your immune system responds to that food.
So what are if say somebody comes into you and they're super inflamed, right? They have maybe one of those 5, maybe they have multiple, maybe they have all 5, right?
Sure.
Where do you start with them? I know you've talked about using fasting as a tool,
Mhm.
but strategic fasting, strategic keto. Like I know there's no one size fits all, but for somebody who's maybe dealing with some of these inflammatory
Mhm.
um responses, like what is your protocol for them?
So I actually would for sure go keto with that individual, because what's lovely is the mechanisms physiologically of ketosis are going to be pretty broad or consistent. Now, how tight someone needs to adjust their macros as far as carb restriction, grams of fat, grams of protein is very individualized. But getting that person to become a hybrid machine of using both ketones and glucose as fuel instead of just an exclusive sugar burner is going to absolutely reduce oxidative stress. And when we reduce oxidative stress, we reduce inflammation. There's also a lot of mechanisms of when we have BHB in the bloodstream, which is beta hydroxybutyrate, which is what a ketone body is. When we have ketones through floating through our bloodstream, they actually can inhibit a lot of inflammatory pathways. So the NLRP3 pathway is a big one that we're looking at in research with the immune system, and why keto is a really great way to arm you for cold, flu, and viral season, because it can actually down regulate too much of that. If we heard of, like with pandemic, the cytokine storm, or basically, when the immune system is battling, it puts out a lot of pro-oxidative response. And that's what can drive organ damage. That's what can actually create more exacerbated symptoms, et cetera. So the body uses inflammation to battle, or to get rid of a pathogen. But ketosis is one of the great modulators, and that's what actually it's been called. There's a really cool research study called I think it's called keto, an immune modulating approach to wellness or something like that, because it doesn't have this like light switch turning on or off inflammation. Keto actually helps the body in not going overdrive in an inflammatory pathway.
Hmm.
Um, like I said, also it reduces oxidative stress. So when we have less reactive oxygen species in the brain, we see that the brain works better with ketones floating through the bloodstream. We see that joint inflammation is down. I mean, so that would be something that I would say for sure. Then we just have to determine, specific to that individual, how deep we need to go into ketosis to not drive too much of a stress response and over restrict. And then, we'd want to also be strategic of making sure that it's not just if it fits your macros to get into ketosis, but that it's still a whole food nourishing approach.
What are some of your favorite foods for somebody new going on the keto diet?
Yeah, so I mean, I love to really simplify it and dumb it down. And so I always say, the biggest faux pas I think of people that read keto on the internet or join like a quick, ebook or course or whatnot is that they overconsume fat. Now, a classic ketogenic diet is a 4-to-1 ratio of fat combined with carb and protein. And that is the ratio that you need if you're looking to harness epilepsy. So, very unique to use therapeutic ketosis for brain seizure activity. Anyone else outside of that spectrum that is doing nutritional ketosis generally is doing it actually to just produce ketone bodies for those benefits, and also to shed body fat or to get that muscle reserve approach. And so, when I'm doing a keto approach, I actually am really poignant on making sure that that individual is getting protein. They might start a little bit with a fat fueled fast if they don't have more than 30 pounds to lose. But if they have more than 30 pounds on the scale to lose, they have enough in their deep freezer. They don't need to introduce fat in the morning. If you don't have 30 pounds to lose and you're just looking at, a kind of shift of 10 pounds here or there, or just performance or just optimizing, then you might start your day with fat right off the bat. And the idea of that is that you're priming your body that this is your fuel choice of optimal. So here's the fat. It could be tablespoon or two of olive oil with salt. Could be olive oil with lemon as a shooter. Could be coconut oil and grass fed butter or ghee. Those are more of a kind of like the classic. What is that called? Bulletproof fast, if you will, with that would have like the MCT with the butter in there. But what I always say, buyer beware of a fat fueled fast, is many people consume 600 calories of fat, and then they're wondering why they're not losing weight. And so again, it's really just getting like that 135 to 200 calories of fat in my perspective of what I generally see to kind of prime the body and then hit it pretty soon with protein, making sure that if you break your fast, it's always done with minimum 20 to 30 grams of protein and that we're getting enough protein throughout the day because that classic keto pie chart will actually set up a lot of people, especially postmenopausal women, into muscle wasting. And they're not going to see the results of getting into that body fat because they're feeding fat too much in the diet. So you need to make sure you kind of stimulate the use of fat as fuel, but then you feed with protein to feed the muscle so we don't catabolize and break down. And you let the body find the fat from what you're holding.
Hmm. So for somebody who works out a decent amount, trains, exercises, like we're always taught, I took a nutrition coaching course a couple years ago, and they were so keen on carbs before workout and then also having
Uh-huh.
like, a 2 to 3 to 1 ratio of like carb to protein after that for somebody who's maybe going from eating a decent amount of carbs to a lower carb ketogenic approach. Um, you know, I know the carbs like and like that ratio of the smoothie helps, kind of down regulate the central nervous system, kind of, bring your
Mhm.
body in like into more of a rest and digest state. Like how should they go about, like, their training, their exercise? Should they take a step back from that? Should they have most of their carbs around their workouts? How do you kinda instruct people with that?
So athletes and those that hold a good amount of muscle mass kind of go against what I just said. They're going to need to feed a lot of fat because they don't have that deep freezer, right? Like these, again, especially if you're like 10% body fat or less, then that individual needs to for sure feed at 70% of their diet in fat. A really good athlete that I like, Robert Sykes, he goes under the name Keto Savage. He's a professional bodybuilder. He's a good buddy of mine, and he's been tight ketogenic. And he has Keto Brick is one of his products, and it's 1,000 calorie brick. Again, because that type of population needs to eat high amounts of fat, high concentrate, because they're just burning. So yes, they still have to replete in their muscle with amino acids with protein, but he stays super tight, like 30 grams of carbs or less throughout his entire training. I think that there's a lot of new information on, like glycolytic workouts and potentially, yes, if we were to carb feed, it makes sense actually post workout to replete glycogen stores. But we really just don't see a lot of metabolic research out there to preload with carbs. That's all been kind of food. So like those pasta dinners before marathons and all those types of things. Really, there's not a lot to back that on a metabolic research approach.
Sure. I wanted to backtrack a little bit to something you said about like cold and flu season, or
Mhm.
if we're heading into that right now. So with that, I just remember growing up as a kid. It's like, oh, chicken noodle soup, lots of fruit and orange juice, right, for the vitamin C, and all these things that and parents, we don't really know any better, right? Like you just
Yeah,
that's what you see, and you feed it to them. So hearing what you've been talking about and diving into some of your research, if somebody is starting to feel like a cold or a flu or a virus, or they for sure have a cold or flu or virus or something
yeah.
like that, what is the best way nutritionally to go about that? Should they fast? Should they have more fat? Should they eat bone broth protein? Like, what should we be
Yeah.
doing?
So bone broth is beautiful. So maybe not like the Campbell's chicken noodle soup can or the gluten-based noodles, but bone broth would be fabulous. There has been research done on bone broth itself. A lot of the mechanisms we see is actually that the NAC or N-acetylcysteine. There's a high amount of cysteine in bone broth, and this is a natural expectorant, which can basically break up mucus and phlegm. NAC can also increase white blood cell response, which your white blood cells are your initial immune responder. That's really kind of what will go upregulated or in overproduction mode once we are exposed to a virus or any form of pathogen. So there's definitely mechanisms, and then not to mention the influence of bone broth on our neurological system with glycine, which can convert to GABA and help to keep us feeling super calm but cognitively aware. There's, of course, glutamine, which is an amino acid that supports our gut cells and can repair leaky gut. So I think that doing a bone broth fast would be absolutely appropriate. I think that companies like Fond Bone Broth make it really easy with these lovely elixir jars that you can just heat up. If you can get 3 of those jars in a day, you're at least going to be skating on like 50 grams of protein. So you're not going to be super catabolic. You're also getting a great electrolyte blend, which is important with the sodium and potassium in there. And then you're also going to be getting that white blood cell and NAC boost. So I think that would be lovely. But generally, I do say yes, fasting a fever or a virus, just like if we follow the habits of nature, we'll see like our animals skip eating, or like a wolf would go off in the woods and just kind of lay down and sleep for a couple days. That's all very appropriate. Let your body actually upregulate that autophagy or that cellular cleanup system, and don't force feed. And if you are force feeding anything, it should lead with protein or therapeutics. And the last thing introduced should be carbs. So, unfortunately, the orange juice, getting vitamin C in maybe like your orange zest could be very good. So like zesting the peel of a citrus and incorporating that into your water, lemon, potentially with like olive oil and or honey, especially if having itchiness in the throat. Vitamin C has absolutely favorable research behind it on immune response as well as anti-inflammatory and antioxidant and so much more. Aids in collagen synthesis, helps with production of progesterone. I mean, there's so many players of vitamin C. It metabolizes cortisol and supports our adrenal glands. But orange juice is like lighter fluid for our blood sugar. And so if we're to consume, especially like those like pint glasses of like, 78 grams of carbs, we're looking at like 6+ slices of bread of a carb impact on our body. And it just rockets up our blood sugar. And that actually can take our white blood cell response off guard. And that's one of the arguments that I find myself continuing to say is like, it's not cold flu viral season, it's pie, cookie, candy season. And, so when we consume sugar, or we have dysregulated blood sugar response, our white blood cell, our neutrophil specifically, that type of white blood cell actually downregulates. And so you're taking your bodyguards off the gate, if you will, from that frequency of sugar. And that's something I'm always harping on for kiddos because when they're constantly gunking, it's like you got to rest their body to be able to get that battle reset.
Wow. Yeah, I think that's something that people don't really understand, and something that I've more recently just found out too is like, oh, like the sugar that's in your body, whatever sort of carbohydrate it is, like the virus can feed off that and
Yeah.
continue to
Yeah.
grow. So sounds like the fat and the protein, the bone broth, like it's kind of like a shield from the
Yeah.
virus that starts to kind of create this defense mechanism for your body to shed out that stuff.
Sure. And then, I mean, you can even take it more therapeutic and do like a 40 clove of garlic bone broth where you're like crunching a bunch of garlic in there. I mean, you could add some probiotic from cultured veg. You can always kind of level that base up. But I think absolutely that's that exact example of food as medicine, avoiding the sugars and the carbs in that timestamp, and then having an abundance of these things that actually support the innate mechanisms of the immune response.
Mm. So we've talked a decent amount about fasting, but like I think fasting now is it's like what is fasting? Is it water
Yeah.
only? Is it only having salt? There's, you just mentioned a bone broth fast. There's fat, fat fueled fasted. So for me, like fairly new to the world of fasting. I've done a couple like 24-hour ones. I try not to eat anything really real solid till the afternoon, bone
Mhm.
broth or, things like that in the morning, cacao, some things like that. But what do you define as like a
Yeah.
fast? And what are some of the different ways that we could use various forms of fasting to optimize our health?
Okay. I love this question. And I want to just set the tone to make sure I get this in here on the concept of metabolic flexibility. So, what metabolic flexibility says is, I talked about all the benefits of ketosis. So, we can't get too myopic or tunnel vision in how we define things, both in the medical world, but also in the, direct to consumer human space, I suppose. And so when I say I want you to make ketones as a benefit, you might be making ketones at 65 grams of carbs a day. I might be making ketones at 45 grams of carbs a day. Someone who's still doing high intensive exercise might be making ketones at 95 grams of carbs a day. And someone who has severe insulin resistance might not be making ketones until they go below 30 grams of carbs a day, right? So I just want to kind of set that tone of, when we're using these terms like fasting or keto, generally there's these constructs, but then based on our biochemical uniqueness, based on our amount of muscle mass, based on our activity factor, and then based on our stress response, if our body is in survival or regulatory mode, we're going to have a different outcome from those various approaches, if that makes sense. And so just like to kind of lay that there. So like I always hear, well, you can't have a banana in your muffins and call them keto. And I'm like, if I test my blood and I'm making ketones after I eat this banana, I sure as heck can. Now you might look at a list and say, it says no, bananas in the red zone on a keto list. You can't have it. Well, keto is a metabolic state. It's not a yes or no food list, right? And so that's kind of how I look at, again, I'd prefer to get that one banana divided by 12 versus a cup of allulose or some crappy, chemically derived, maybe it's naturally derived, but to take corn into erythritol takes a lot of processes to make it into a white powder kind of thing. And so I prefer that banana. So taking that kind of constructs into fasting, when someone says, well, does that break your fast? I always say, well, first off, fasting is a dimmer switch. It's not a light switch. So it's not like you tip your toe and like, oh, the fasting stopped. Oh, the fasting started, right? Like it's not that on or off or dynamic. It's a dimmer switch. And so we see that calorie restriction and intermittent fasting and ketosis all can have similar mechanisms on autophagy, mTOR, sirtuin. So when we look at some of these mechanisms, the really nerdy stuff on anti-aging, on fighting the brain plaque formation and or having neurological benefits, That's usually what people are looking for, or body fat burn. That's usually why people fast. And so fasting for someone might be a bone broth fast because they're still hypocaloric or lower calorie than eating a full meal. They're not going to be provoking an insulin response. And so they're not going to get disruption in a fed state by those mechanisms. And they might get more therapeutic benefit, especially if they have Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis and they need to bathe their gut in those amino acids that the broth provides and that gelatin and collagen. For fasting, someone might need to add that fat to their fast, like I suggested earlier, especially if keto is new to them because their body's used to only using glucose. And so they have to be given that abundance or that kind of plate of fat offering to start the day for the body to say, okay, should I mess with this and see what happens if I make this other energy substrate? And how does that feel metabolically? So feeding fat for some could be appropriate for fasting. And then for others, they're going to need to do just tea or just water or just black coffee, which would be considered like a pure fast, which is basically 5 or 0 calories. And those individuals ideally, though, again, have that body fat reserve. And where we can go wrong is if we over restrict and don't have what the body needs, and then the body goes into a sympathetic fight or flight mode. And so I would say probably for you, I would watch doing 24-hour fasts because it could drive more autonomic nervous system survival mechanisms, which actually could stress your body, throw off cardiovascular regulatory mechanisms and or just homeostasis in the body because the body's like, well, shit, I don't know if he's gonna feed me tomorrow. So we're just gonna do this for a little bit. And people can see a lot of insomnia, digestive disturbances, some of these epinephrine or adrenaline, like fight or flight surges. I had a guy that is just a biohacking client of mine. And so I think he listens to me as one of his many. And so he was going to go on a 4-day water and salt fast, and I advised against it. And the second or third night, he had to go to a 24-hour clinic because he thought that there were spiders crawling on his body because he had such an adrenaline fight or flight surge of survival. And so when we try to like white knuckle for optimal health, and that's that doctrine creates disconnect, right? When our body's literally saying, like, I'm hungry, it's growling, I think for spiritual mechanisms, maybe, right? But for if we're actually breaking it down and saying a health mechanism, not many people are actually primed to do that full 24 hours because we're not in a parasympathetic space. We're living in blue light, we're living in industrial toxins, we're not out in the woods hunting and hoping to catch a deer, like that would be a reasonable time to fast. If you're camping under the stars, if you're doing it like a hunter gatherer, I think you could make it. I think otherwise, probably not optimal for most unless they have a lot of reserve and that's being medically supported.
Got it. So someone like me, I'm about 6 foot, 185 pounds, doesn't make a whole lot of sense to do just like a water and
Right.
salt only fast.
Right, so you would wanna do, like, a protein and or even fat fast, to really support and get if you wanted to level up ketone production, if you wanted it, right? And so it could still be hypocaloric. Fasting has to be hypocaloric, meaning low calorie, but it does not have to again, dimmer switch, right? It does not have to be distressing and drive imbalance in the body, where the body is totally in this surge of survival, and so if you're typically consuming, let's say, 2,800 calories, you could do a very solid fast that was maybe 1,600 calories. You're still in that caloric restriction, but you're getting 120 grams of protein. And so we need to feed the muscle for most individuals.
Got it. And I know we are running out of time here, but I did want to talk to you about, you know, what you have become known for, and that's the anti-anxiety diet, right? That's kind of
Yeah.
how I stumbled upon your content. It's really, really fascinating. So, what is the anti-anxiety diet and how did you come up with it?
Yeah. So the anti-anxiety diet, I think I started to come up with upon my diagnosis with Hashimoto's thyroiditis, which was in 2008. And, I started to, as I redefine my relationship with food, really dig into these ancestral principles of leaky gut and gut repair, digging into this idea that it's not just this one size fits all of inflammation, understanding the interworkings of our gut microbiome. And so I broke down the anti anxiety diet into 6 R's. And the way that I wrote the book, so there's a nonfiction book, like the nerdy deep dive read, and that's the anti anxiety diet. And then I did come out with the anti anxiety diet cookbook in 2019. But the anti anxiety diet provides the reader an opportunity to understand what is their Achilles heel or what is their weak point or their entry point that could be throwing them off. And although it's called the anti anxiety diet, I would say it's really a broader approach to anyone because it's really looking at our HPA axis, which is our hypothalamus pituitary adrenals. So parts of our brain and our adrenal known survival glands and how our body is responding. Because my hypothesis with the anti anxiety diet is that stress is the Achilles heel to wellness. So if we are not managing our stress response and we are in a chronic fight or flight mode, we will just be playing whack-a-mole with various symptoms. So you might have leaky gut and then you address that with a glutamine powder and bone broth. Okay, well then you're going to have dysbiosis because your microbiome was sterilized with stress and now you had a yeast flare. Well, now you have nutritional deficiency because and so I really find that beyond targeted supplementation, beyond food as medicine, we have to harness the wild stallion of the brain, if you will. And there's just so many mechanisms that I have nerded out about that are these physiological or biochemical chicken and egg responses. So the book goes through how to remove inflammation. And in that chapter, I present the ketogenic diet, and sugar is one of the things we remove in there, but we remove 5 different foods. We look to repair the gut lining, to restore our microbiome. We look to rebound our adrenals, to reset our micronutrient status, and then to rebalance our neurotransmitters. So that chapter goes deep dive into amino acid therapies, learning about dopamine versus serotonin versus GABA versus glutamate and how they respond in the brain and body. But what I love about the book is each chapter will give you a quiz or a symptom survey as well as recommendations for lab assessments. So when you read, someone might read it and say, "Oh my gosh, this microbiome part, this is it. I'm having, skin flares, I'm having bloating and distension, and I've been approaching it all the wrong way. I need to delve into this area of work." Or someone else that had to evacuate from a hurricane might be coming in at the rebound the adrenals because they've been in this fight or flight survival mode. Or a new mama that has been breastfeeding or holding a baby for 2, 3 years now, maybe she has 2 kiddos, might be in that restore your micronutrients because she's given all everything she's had to her babies. And so that's kind of how I've written the book, is that each of these R's are very intimately integrated, if you will, and all important to address. But the reader will have one of those areas that's the louder, that really needs to be addressed on a functional medicine level. And then to learn about the other R's and be proactive in abundance work or getting some of these nutrients in, or maybe playing with some of the supplement suggestions, would really help to move the dial into the body feeling safe again. And I feel that when the human body feels safe, this is where wellness resides. If the body is in a survival mode, we're just waiting for another disease state to come up.
Allie, you are a freaking wealth of knowledge, a wealth of information. I learned so much today. I think I could talk to you for the next 4 hours, but I want to be respectful of your time. We'll definitely have to link up because I did not know you were close to Austin. So we'll have to link
Yeah.
up and do round two in person. But I just want to say thank you for all the work that you're doing and just, being a pioneer and a catalyst for just really helping people, optimize and radically improve their health. If people want to learn more about you, if they want to check out your podcast, YouTube channel, book, all of that, what's the best way for them to get in touch with you?
Yeah, so Ali Miller RD, just ALIMILLER RD.com is my primary website. That's where I have my books. I have virtual programs. I have my functional medicine clinic and my supplement line there. And then Naturally Nourished is the name of my podcast and YouTube.
One of my favorite resources is Naturally Nourished, the podcast and the YouTube channel.
Awesome.
I'll have all of that stuff linked in the show notes. Allie, I appreciate your time, and I just am so looking forward to all of the impact that you'll continue to create.
Thanks so much. It's been a fun conversation.
Thank you guys so much for tuning into today's episode. I wanted to give you all a heads up too that I launched a free community on the Upspace app where you can join, ask me questions, connect with like-minded individuals, follow my 4-week running and strength training program that has some dedicated mobility sessions in there as well, so that we can all optimize our health and fitness together. So if you're interested, head over to the App Store, download the Upspace app, and join the Pure Ambition community today. Love you guys, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.